Kyrie. We're starting part 2. So in part 1, we learned the Greek alphabet together. And for each letter, I gave you an example word starting with that letter that's used very frequently in the Greek Bible, okay? Well, we're working with those same words this time, so we're going to review the meaning and go more deeply into the meaning. We're also going to use those same example passages for context, but we're going to start building on those, okay? And the ultimate goal of all of these is that we learn to read and understand and appreciate the Greek Bible in the original. So to facilitate that, then we're going to pick up some grammar as we go, okay? And so for a lot of this, you can pick it up as we go along through repetition, okay? But for some of these things, you absolutely have to memorize some of the grammar and some of the forms. And so that is the case with what we're doing in this lesson, which is case endings. And I'm going to talk about this in a lot of detail. I'm going to give analogies to English grammar, and we're going to come back to this too in the future, okay? So in other words, if you don't completely get this, please just memorize the forms, and we'll keep working with it, and it will become second nature before very long, like once you have a little more experience reading it, okay? So as we're getting started on this, let's start with English grammar and a really quick review of some of the basic terms there before we move to the Greek and the way that the Greek grammar functions. Okay, so in English, you typically have word order that's going to determine what role a word plays in a given sentence. Okay, so for the simplest independent clause or sentence, all you need is a subject and a verb, right? So he reads. That's a perfectly good sentence, right? Okay. He is the subject, so it's the noun that's doing the action. Reads is the verb. Okay. We can also add a direct object. What is it that he's reading? Well, he reads the Bible. So Bible is going to be the direct object. Okay, so it's what's affected by the action of the verb. Okay, well, you can also add an indirect object. So what would that look like? He reads the Bible to her. So he, that's the subject, reads, that's the verb, the Bible, that's the direct object, and we use the preposition to, and her, that's the indirect object, okay? So with that, real quick review in mind, if you don't understand any of those terms or need a sort of grammar review in English, I'd recommend, that you do that first, okay? Otherwise, let's move on and look at the way that English word order is typically going to tell you, what role a given noun especially is going to play in a sentence. Okay, so English word order is typically subject, verb, direct object. Okay, so it's going to be he reads the book, okay, rather than if you have a sentence that starts out the book reads, you're going to start, it's going to raise the question, how is the book reading? Okay, because typically an English sentence is going to start out with the subject, okay? Okay, well, in Greek, you can have varied word orders. And so it's actually going to be the case endings that are going to tell you what role a noun plays in a sentence. Is this noun the subject? Is it the direct object? Is it the indirect object? Or is it playing some other role in the sentence? Well, the case endings in Greek are going to tell you that. Now, in English, this isn't completely foreign to the way that English functions, okay? And so let me show you an example here as an analogy before we get into the Greek forms, okay? So in English, with the personal pronouns, let's take the third person singular personal pronouns, he and she. Okay, well, you have here in this chart on the right, you've got he and she, so that's in the subjective version of this pronoun. But you've also got him and her. That's in the objective form of those pronouns. Okay, so how does that work? Well, if he or she, if it's the subject of a sentence, then you're going to use that subjective form, he or she. Okay, he reads. She reads. On the other hand, if you've got one of these as, let's say, the indirect object, the direct object or the indirect object of a sentence, then you're going to use the appropriate objective form, which is going to be him or her. Okay, so if you had he reads the book to her, you're not going to say he reads the book to she, right? So you've got different endings depending on what role it's playing in the sentence, right? Okay. Well, Greek does a similar thing, but it has more cases. Okay, and so there are more endings that are going to give you more specific information than just whether it's a subject or some sort of object. And we're not going to cover all of those this time. Okay, we're just going to start out though with these. If you look to the left of the chart, in the Koine Greek we're learning, the nominative case is going to be used to designate the subject. Okay. The accusative case is specific for the direct object. The dative case is going to be used for the indirect object. So whereas in English, you've only got one form that's going to cover both of those. All right, okay. In other words, if you have the direct object of a sentence, it's going to be him, but if it's in the indirect object, it'll also be him. Well, Greek is going to have two different forms that way. Okay. Okay, so let's look at this and bring up just the masculine singular forms of the definite article. So the definite article is the in English, the. Okay, so we're going to start with learning this because, as you've seen from part 1, the definite article is used very frequently in Greek. In some cases, when and where we would not use the definite article in English, right? Like with people's names. The Peter says. Okay, so we've seen that kind of thing, right? Okay, so here we have then the nominative form masculine, the accusative, and the dative. And with Greek nouns and adjectives, they have gender, which is just a grammatical, is it masculine, feminine, or neuter. They have the case ending. which is, we're going over just now. And then they're going to have number, in other words, singular or plural. Well, English has all of those too in some forms to a limited extent. But for Greek, it's every noun, every adjective is going to have case, number, gender. Okay? And you have more cases with the Greek forms than with any of the English forms. Okay? Okay, so let's talk about then how would you translate each of these? Because we're doing this for reading, right? Like this isn't a prose comp class where you have to learn how to write a sentence in Greek. This is for recognition and for reading as we're going through this amazing text. So, okay, when you see something in the nominative, remember that means it's the subject. So a trial translation for that, which I've got over on the right in the quotation marks, would be blank verbs. So in other words, let's say that our word that we have is anthropos, which means person, okay, and it's in the nominative. Well, then we know as we see that word in the nominative, our trial translation for that is going to be a person, verbs. And so then we've got to see what the verb is in that sentence. Okay. Well, in this case, it's going to be ha anthropos, so the man. So our trial translation here, if we had ha anthropos, it would be the man, verbs. Accusative case. Well, then we know that whatever this noun is, it's going to be, our trial translation for it is going to be that it's the direct object. So that the subject of the sentence, verbs, anthropon, or ton anthropon, the man. And the dative of trial translation is going to be to or for. So if we saw anthropoi, in other words, if we saw a dative ending on the word anthropos, then it would be to or for man, okay? If it's toi anthropoi, to or for the man. Okay, so if this doesn't make sense yet, we're coming back to it. We're going to go over it again. Okay, so let's look at all of these masculine, feminine, neuter, gender forms just for these three cases in the singular. Okay, and what we've got here is then the definite article, which is the, ha, he, ta. Okay, so that's the nominative form in masculine, ha, feminine, he, and the neuter, ta. Okay, so it's going to be translated as the same word, the. And in this case, for the nominative, remember this is the one that's telling you, okay, this word is the subject here. All right, ton, tain, ta, that's the accusative, telling you it's going to be the direct object. Toi, te, toi, to or for can be used for the indirect object. Okay, well, let's talk about, as you're reading, how are you going to recognize these? Start memorizing this and get these memorized now, and it's really going to help you when you start learning the endings of different nouns and adjectives and their case endings, because these case endings for the definite article are going to match those for other declensions that we're going to learn. Okay, but also just knowing the forms of the definite article, it's going to be a great sort of hint and an easy sort of way of knowing what case the noun it's attached to is in. All right, so Okay, recognizing the nominative case, it's got to memorize these ha, hey, and ta. In the accusative, if you notice here, it's the new ending that's going to be a marker. So if you've got the definite article with a new ending, you're going to know it's an accusative. And then the ta form for the neuter, well, there's some ambiguity there, right? Is it the accusative or is it the nominative? Context is going to have to tell you. With the dative form, if you see iota subscript with the definite article here, you're going to know this is in the dative case. And so iota subscript, if you look underneath the omega there in toy for the masculine, or see how you've got that little tiny mark right under the eta in te for the feminine. And again, in the neuter, you have the iota, that little mark right under the omega with the nu. It's telling you that's iota subscript. So it's pronounced like iota, but instead of being written to the right of the letter, it's written underneath it. Okay, so those are pronounced toy, te, and toy. Okay, so anyway, that's how you can recognize those forms, but please memorize this chart, okay, before we go on. And so if you want to take a break and do that, and then come back to it and review it and put in some more memory work with this, it'll pay off in a big way in the long run. It's not a whole lot to commit to memory here, but it's very essential. There's not going to be too much of this that I'm asking you to commit to memory, but this one's really important.